is my delight to introduce to you Dr. Will Tattersdill. He is a part of the Department of English at the University of Birmingham. He's a literary critic who writes on the relationship between science and popular culture. He has published on the topics of the fin de siècle science fiction, the animals of Star Trek, and the history of natural history museums. He is currently working on the social history of dinosaurs for Bloomsbury and editing an edition of H.G. Wells' short stories for the Oxford University Press. If his talk inspires any thoughts, please tweet them with the hashtag MidsPop2021, and any questions, post them in the chat. Feel free to take it away, Will.
Thanks very much. Jay, just could you let me know if you're seeing that slide and hearing me and stuff?
We are indeed.
Perfect, wonderful, thank you, and thank you too for the invitation, and thank you to everybody who's still here at the end of a really interesting afternoon. It's a real privilege to be invited to something like this, and my thanks to Jade and to Reese and to the entire committee. All right, so here we go. Space, reality. It's more than a linear path. It's a prism of endless possibilities where a single choice can branch out into infinite realities, creating alternate worlds from the ones you know. I am the watcher. I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if? This is the opening monologue to a new show that is on Disney Plus right now, called What If, and it's being it's the kind of one of the latest entries into the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And the premise of the show is kind of interesting, as it takes moments in big Marvel films, I'm sure most of us know at least some of these movies, and imagines them differently. So the first episode, for example, is about Peggy Carter rather than Steve Rogers becoming Captain America. And it's a gesture that we're probably quite used to if we're used to alternate history at all at the moment in the way it works. It's about a very small decision having very large consequences. So this is about Peggy choosing to just stay in a room instead of leave a room at one point. And the results when they kind of spiral out through this half-hour animated episode fundamentally change the events of the MCU and of the subsequent movies. The second episode, only 2 episodes are out at the moment. The second one is about T'Challa, the Black Panther, becoming Star-Lord in Guardians of the Galaxy instead of the Black Panther. I'm starting here with this recent Disney Plus show for a few different reasons. The first is to demonstrate my relentless contemporaneity, because there's Victorian stuff coming up in this keynote, and I want you to know that I am alive in the 2020s also. The other thing is that I wanted to make the point that alternate history is closer and closer to the mainstream at the moment. It's increasingly something that is everywhere, and this is a point I'm going to be returning to really throughout this talk. Finally, though, the real reason I wanted to start here is that it suggests to me, this What If show suggests to me, that our fascination with alternate history is about authorship as much as it is about narrated events. And what I mean by that really is that Captain America, the first Avenger, the film that first episode of What If is riffing off, is already an alternate history. It is already a retelling of World War II that involves kind of mutants and weird chemicals and aliens and from people from other dimensions and demons and all sorts of other things. So to have the alternate of the alternate in this way seems to me to begin to reflect on the composition processes of the MCU. And I think we are in a phase 4, where that reflection is coming to the front a little bit. We're thinking here about not only what would have happened if Peggy Carter had become Captain America, but also about what would have happened if Marvel had had the courage for a female-led movie 10 years earlier than it actually did, 10 years and 19 films earlier than it did when it finally released Black Widow just recently. And so this is my first big suggestion that I want to make in this talk, is that alternate history is often about texts being different as much as it is about events being different. And so we think we're thinking about history panning out differently. We're often also, or even perhaps primarily, thinking about if written words had been different or changed in some way. Yet while fan speculation about what might have been is clearly at the back of Marvel's new series in certain ways, it's still very unusual indeed, at least in my reading of it, for literary critics, people like me, to openly engage in counterfactual thinking. In other words, to look at a novel or a film or a series, but I'm in this talk going to focus mostly on books, with apologies to colleagues from other disciplines. What if this book had been written differently? What then? It's the sort of thing that we tend to be happy to talk about in pubs, but very seldom happy to talk about in print. And so when I call this talk Towards a Counterfactual Criticism, that's what I'm talking about, really, about trying to move us in a direction where this kind of thinking might be something that we were allowed to do. In moving towards counterfactual criticism, I'm moving, I think, towards a way of reading that considers or allows us to consider versions of a text which do not exist. And this isn't just famous things like the missing second half of Dickens's famously uncompleted Mystery of Edwin Drood, for example. I'm suggesting this really more, I suppose, as part of a close reading toolkit, as part of something that we might do in the routine examination of completed or settled literary texts. Now, that comes with an important caveat, which is that I'm not suggesting that we do this to improve or to replace the objects of our study, but rather to cast new light on them. Because just as episode 1 of What If might cause us to reflect differently on the canonical events of the first Avenger, or indeed of the gender politics of the MCU, so it is that by imagining, yes, imagining different literary texts, we might gain insight into what we do have. We might find ways of seeing them differently, or of asking different questions of them. For historians on the whole, counterfactuals continue to be very disreputable things. So Richard Evans, and he's a scholar. I picked his Guardian piece just because it was a bit more photogenic than putting a picture of an article up here. But here he is. And when he says what if is a waste of time, he's not talking about the new Marvel series, although I suspect that he probably wouldn't like it very much. This is the whole enterprise of asking what if from a historian standpoint for Evans, is, well, you see it there, misguided and outdated. But he does write in this same piece in 2014 that this kind of fantasizing, and I think it's interesting that he uses that word, by the way, this kind of fantasizing is now all the rage. And he said he means all the rage in academic history. I'm not completely sure that's true, by the way, but I think it's certainly a just remark of popular culture more broadly. My sense is that asking these kinds of questions about might have beens, could have beens, and even should have beens has been growing in us for a while now. It has, as everything does when you ask a Victorianist about it, 19th century roots. So for a lot of people, a flashpoint is Louis Geoffroy's 1836 book, Napoleon and the Conquest of the World. Geoffroy was actually distantly related to Napoleon, and it will surprise you to learn that his opinion is that if Napoleon had been victorious in the Napoleonic Wars, then the world would be a much better place, a utopia, in fact. There would be a sort of world government and this brilliant futuristic society, and there would be no hunger and there would be no poverty, and everything would be fantastic. This is a great example, I suppose, of not only kind of how utopian alternate history used to be. It's very often dystopian now. Usually we prefer to imagine worse worlds than the one that we currently live in, although I don't know precisely where the pleasure comes from in that, but also in how immediately it becomes susceptible to the ideological preoccupations of whoever's writing it. So then G.M. Trevelyan comes back at the other end of the 19th century and writes another book about if Napoleon had won, and Trevelyan is British, and it will surprise you to learn that he thinks that it would have been a disaster if Napoleon had won, and the world would be a very terrible place. Nothing particularly complicated is happening here. Another often cited example of kind of early sort of academic, I suppose, or non-fictional alternate history, if we can use that phrase without giving ourselves too much of a headache, is John Squires' edited collection, If It Had Happened Otherwise. I love that title, of 1931. This includes essays by some really big hitters of the day, including A.J.P. Taylor and G.K. Chesterton. And you can see on the cover there an essay by Winston Churchill about if Lee had not won the Battle of Gettysburg. We like this, I suggest, because we're used to thinking of Churchill as an historical actor, as a subject of counterfactual speculation, rather than a source of it. And of course, in 1931, Churchill was not to do any of the many, many things that later alternate history would start to play with. But the Second World War is, as I'm sure a lot of you know, a particular flashpoint for interest in alternate historical writing. So Niall Ferguson's attempt to echo this collection of Squires's in 1997, which is called Virtual History, and is kind of the proximate cause of Evans's ire, at least in part because it's couched as a rejoinder to Marxism, right? So for Ferguson, Marxism is something in which history is always determined. And so the very idea that history could have gone differently is kind of runs contrary to the Marxist project. But by the time Virtual History comes out, at the other end of the 20th century from Squires, the game has changed in a really fundamental way. And the big reason for that, there are lots of reasons for that, the whole 20th century has happened, but one of the big reasons for that is that the novelists have got their hands on it in a really lasting way. Here are just a couple of the highlights. 1962, Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle, still probably the most famous alternate history novel ever written, but no less important in its day. 1976, Kingsley Amos's The Alteration, and 1992's Fatherland by Robert Harris. I don't know how many of you are going to know these books in their different ways. They're all important and rather fabulous, and they're very different from each other. It's always kind of it's always a little bit kind of artificial drawing these little neat timelines. It doesn't quite work. But I think, one of the things that these novels have in common in their very different ways is that accurately working out what would happen in, for example, the case of a Nazi victory is not wholly the point. So for Harris, for example, so Fatherland, for those of you who don't know, is a detective novel set in 1960s Berlin, but it's a 1960s Berlin in which Hitler was victorious in the Second World War. So we're still in the Third Reich, and it's 1960, and everything is going wrong in a slightly different way. And I don't think that Harris thinks that the events of this book are what definitely would have happened if only the war had turned out differently. The quote-unquote scientific exercise of what you might call a parsimonious counterfactual history. I think that he thinks it's a good provocation for world building, and that's a word I'm not going to use very often in this talk, but I think it's a very important one, and one that we don't pay homage to enough, at least in my field. World building, that idea of generating a world in which to tell a story, rather than generating a theory about how reality could or should have gone. But also, of course, and this is what Dick is most famous for, kind of quasi-philosophical speculation about what it is to exist in history at all. And that is something that The Man in the High Castle does very well, arguably has never been bettered at, but it's something I think that all alternate history is playing with to a greater or a lesser extent. So what I'm doing here with this kind of extremely belt and braces summary of alternate history as an enterprise is I'm beginning to suggest this distinction, and it's not mine. It comes from a lot of other scholars, in particular Karen Hellickson, but this distinction between counterfactual history and alternate history. Counterfactual history is a parsimonious attempt to predict the past differently. If only Custer had turned left, right? If only Hitler hadn't invaded Russia. That's counterfactual history. Alternate history, on the other hand, an imaginative exercise which takes a past change merely as a jumping off point. And the thing that I want to kind of lay stress on at this point in the talk is that this distinction is, of course, far too easy, because counterfactual history struggles to entirely rid itself of the imagination. That's why a lot of academic historians don't want anything to do with it. And equally, alternate history, even when its deviations are fantastical, is often, if not always, deeply concerned with the historiographic and with the ways that history is written and understood and experienced. Okay, but so if counterfactual history is broadly frowned upon within academia, and alternate history as a sort of military historians enclave of science fiction, the ghetto within the ghetto, has not really much of a better reputation, then why am I advocating for a counterfactual criticism? Why do I think that criticism needs to get its hands dirty with this? There are lots of answers to this question, but the one I want to focus on for now is everyone does it all the time. And so my kind of text example of this is Kate Atkinson's book, Life After Life. And if you only go away and read one book that I talk about today, I would love it if it were this one. This is a really remarkable novel for all sorts of reasons. And for those of you who don't know it, it's a novel about a woman who every time she dies gets to start again from birth, right? And she doesn't remember her previous lives exactly, but she retains a vague sense of the danger of the decision that led to her demise the last time. And so she knows to choose a different route. So it's a novel about branching paths. And it's a novel in which the might-have-beens get explored very explicitly. The reason I think it's remarkable for the purposes of this conversation is that it's, despite this remarkable and kind of crazy starting premise, it's actually a very sober novel that is not remotely interested, in my reading of it, in being science fictional or exploring the kind of the philosophical implications of multiple realities. What Atkinson is interested in, I think, is the Second World War, and she wants a way of telling that history from as many different angles as possible. So her protagonist here, in some lives is blitzed, and in some lives is evacuated, and in some lives is behind enemy lines in Germany, and you just get the war from every possible viewpoint. It's a remarkable piece of work. What I think it demonstrates, at least partly, is that alternate history has gone mainstream, right? This novel won the Costa. So we're, if you can describe the Costa as mainstream, of course, as we know here in a popular culture network, literary bestsellers tend to sell many fewer copies than most genre texts. But anyway, moving on from that, look, if counterfactual thinking can win the Costa, we can find it anywhere, right? And this, of course, is the point. You don't even have to go to Atkinson. You just have to think about your day. I mean, we've probably done this today, each and every single one of us. If I had put that there instead of here, if I had caught this bus instead of that one, if I had made this or that decision, this is a way people think. So something that I say to students when I'm teaching this subject quite often, because undergraduates tend to have this one kind of ready, most of them are considering more than one university as a place to do their undergraduate degree. So I say to them, have you ever thought about what would have happened if you'd gone to the other place, if your grades had been slightly worse or slightly better? And you can, out of 9 out of 10 times, you can get a pretty good conversation going about that, because they will have thoughts, as I'm sure many people here do, about how that very small difference would have panned out into the rest of their lives. The road's not taken. We're fascinated by these things. And one of the things I'm able to say to them, by the way, is that, my alternate history module is, I'm pretty sure, the only module on alternate history in Britain. So if you had made that other decision, then you wouldn't even be thinking about other decisions. Anyway, it's fun. It's fun. So if alternate history is kind of a niche micro genre of popular fiction in one sense, I think there's another sense in which it's a pretty fundamental impulse, something that we're all doing all the time, shared even by those of us who don't hold a view on how the early invention of the tank would have affected the outcome of the American Civil War, for instance. Writing after Stuart Hampshire, Andrew H. Miller calls this the optative mood. So Miller's article is a really good one, actually, and I recommend it. It is largely about Charles Dickens's novel Great Expectations of 1860 to 61. And I picked here some cover art which shows Pip is the protagonist, looking at a signpost pointing in three different directions. Thank you very much, Charles Dickens, artist. I think this isn't Fizz. This is John. I've forgotten the name of this artist. Doesn't matter. Very convenient for me. Pip makes lots of decisions. Pip, Miller points out, spends a lot of time thinking about if things had gone differently. Spends a lot of time thinking, oh, if only I had. Not to simplify the book, but if only I had been less of a jackass at points X, Y, and Z, then what would have happened? How would my life have been different? And Miller kind of uses this text as a way into thinking about counterfacticity in the Victorian novel more generally, and does a really good kind of catalogue of moments all the way through to Virginia Woolf, where characters in fiction are popping up and saying, I wonder what would have happened if this had happened. And it happens, if you read Miller's article, I hope you'll be persuaded of this. It happens more often than you'd think based on how often critics talk about it. Miller's one failing, in my opinion, is that he doesn't attend to the point that I started with when I was talking about Marvel's What If show, this point about the extra textual dimension. Because Great Expectations famously has two endings, right? And there's a lot of debate about which is the right one. Most scholarly editions print both, and you have to choose which you want to read, and that's a big conversation that you can have. And Miller does mention that, like, kind of right at the end. But on the whole, he's reluctant to think about how these optative moments in literary texts are borne out by the world around them, by the people who wrote them, by the people who read them. His examples are all about characters playing what if. He resists the temptation to do so himself. He does have a moment where he thinks about the critic Miller at this moment writing in the situation that he's in and kind of how he got there. But again, that doesn't quite follow through into a discussion of how the optative mood or the counterfactual might work as a kind of as a way of writing and understanding literature. In other words, as a way of understanding form as well as content, I suppose. So this is where I'm going to slow down a little bit and think about one text through the lens of its optative mood. And the text I've chosen for this is pretty much deliberately the most canonical, least science fiction-y, least popular fiction-y text that I could possibly think of, which is Elizabeth Gaskell's incredible novel Wives and Daughters of 1864 to 66. I won't ask you if you've read this one. It's a biggie, and it's not Gaskell's most popular novel. It's her last novel. It's extremely good, although I would say that you probably have to be into Victorian literature before you should give it a go. It is very much a Victorian book. My thoughts in choosing it, right? And this is kind of, this is my kind of stop the talk, this is why we're here moment. Look, when we fight these tired battles, like the battle for the inclusion of the popular in the higher education curriculum, which we've heard a little bit about in the questions to the previous session, a battle that in my field at least is largely won now, but which still occasionally kind of twitches like the zombie you didn't quite finish killing at the end of the movie. When we fight those battles and say, we should be able to study the popular at university, I put it to you that we don't just want to include popular fiction on syllabuses. What we want is its presence to change how we can work with other kinds of literature, how we can think about other kinds of literature. We want the popular to suggest new ways of reading to us, just as we hope, I think, that the questions raised in order to encounter canonical literature can help us see the popular in a new way. So with that in mind, that agenda of kind of turning the inclusion of the popular at university into critical practice, what does it mean to read Wives and Daughters with science fiction? With here meaning both using and alongside. Towards the end of the novel, Mrs. Gibson, who is kind of the evil stepmother character, but she's also kind of awesome. She has an episode of what Mitchell would call the optative mood. She says, "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you had been my real daughter, and Cynthia, dear papa's, and Mr. Kirkpatrick and your own dear mother had all lived. People talk a good deal about natural affinities. It would have been a question for a philosopher." And I love the retreat there on would have been a question. It's not even a question in this universe, right? This is, I hope you'll agree with me, this is exactly the sort of thing I've been talking about this whole time. And you don't have to know really who she's talking to here, or who Cynthia is, or who Mr. Kirkpatrick is. Although, you know, it is a good book and you should read it. You should get a minute. And by a minute, I mean about 6 weeks. What I want you to focus on is the fact that this kind of rears its head in a chapter that is very close to the end of the novel, in a way that kind of casts back over the events of the novel, which begin pretty much with the childhood of the person she's talking to. So being invited, it's not just that the character is being invited to see their life differently, it's that the reader is being invited to think about the novel differently. This is not the only optative moment in this chapter from Mrs. Gibson, who also says at a slightly later point in the same chapter, "I should so have liked to belong to this generation. I always think if you had gone to the bar," this is to her husband, "you might have succeeded better if you'd become a lawyer instead of a doctor. He only became a doctor. He's useless." So Mrs. Gibson is a bit of a reacher. She's thinking about if her life had been different here and elsewhere. We're not meant to approve of this. She's never happy with her lot, and this is something that's bad about her. But I think it's not just that, right? So when she says, "I should so have liked to belong to this generation," the generation she's talking about there is, because the novel is set back in time from when it was written, is the generation to which Mrs. Gaskell herself belongs. So that, I think, is a moment of Gaskell reflecting upon her life through Mrs. Gibson, which is very complicated because, like I say, we don't necessarily like Mrs. Gibson that much. So we're thinking here about, well, so Mrs. Gibson is thinking here, and therefore Gaskell is thinking, and therefore we are thinking about what if her life had been different? What if the book had been different? And here I won't have time to talk about this properly, which is very vexing to me because it's the thing I like to talk about the most. But here we need to remember that this is being published in a periodical, and that the people reading this when it first comes out have been reading it for about 18 months. So they are casting back over their lives in a way that we don't when we read these large novels very, very quickly now. It's always important to remember Victorian books are read very differently in the Victorian period from how we read them now. Bit of a sidebar. My point is that coming close to the end as it does, all of these little moments from Mrs. Gibson sort of add a kind of a tone of contingency to the end, as if we start to think about the possibility of the ending being different. And this is one heightened just a couple of pages later by the glyph, which announces Mrs. Gaskell's death. So she died with the novel unfinished. And after that glyph, nearly at the bottom of page 11 of the January 1866 edition of Cornhill magazine, her editor, Frederick Greenwood, picks up to write the last little bit for her. And when he does so, he continues Mrs. Gibson's optative tone. Had the writer lived, she would have sent her hero back to Africa forthwith, and those scientific parts of Africa are a long way from Hamley, and there is not much to choose between a long distance and a long time. And it's that exact same spinning out spooling out that we've been talking about in all of those earlier examples from alternate history. So what does this do? This creates, I think, a mood of regret around the end of the novel, obviously, a particular kind of regret, which casts us back over the past, over Mrs. Gibson's life as Mrs. Gaskell writes it, and Mrs. Gaskell's career as Frederick Greenwood writes it. And by the time they're both done, we're thoroughly in what-if mode. Now, this is important. I fully respect that I'm not talking to Victorianists right now, and you might not think it's important, but this is important. Let me tell you why. Criticism usually regards wives and daughters as done. The words of Angus Eason, introducing the Oxford World's Classics edition, this novel is essentially complete. Right? So this isn't like Edwin Drood, where Dickens dies when it's only half finished, and there's this big mystery that's not set up. When Gaskell died, there's between 1 and 3 chapters of the book missing, but it's basically, in the opinion of most, it's done. We know that how the plot will resolve, we tell ourselves. We know they're going to get married. My reaction to that, we knew they were going to get married from page 100 because this is a Victorian novel. We already knew that. What we don't know is how she would have done it. Okay, we don't know where the proposal would have taken place, right? If it's outside, that's interesting. He's a naturalist. He studies insects and plants. So if we're outside, we're in his realm. If we're in her sitting room, it's her realm. That's a power difference. That's important. We don't know what she was going to do. This kind of thing does matter. So everyone is not talking about Wives and Daughters as a book that has a missing ending because, oh, we've basically got it all. Well, we haven't. As soon as we start attending to form in any way, there are really important things about the end of this novel, as she had planned it, that we don't know. So I'm not going quite here to fall into the trap of my own counterfactual speculations, especially since I'm not a Gaskelian, by the way. I'm thoroughly busking this. But it seems to me like one thing we can say about the real version of this novel, the one we don't have, is that it would be very unlikely to give Mrs. Gibson's counterfactuals the limelight of its closing pages. My sense of Mrs. Gaskell is that she isn't someone who would have given the closing words to Mrs. Gibson, a character she doesn't like over much. Now, I could be wrong about that, but as the novel stands, the last words that Gaskell wrote in it are Mrs. Gibson's, and I don't think that she would have been comfortable giving her the final say. But of course, that version, the hypothetical version, the version Gaskell was planning, that isn't the real version of the text. The real version is the one we have. And critical inattention to the open ending, caused perhaps by a healthy skepticism of the critical imagination, has prevented us from seeing it, right? So I think that where we get from paying attention to how the optative as a mood begins to dominate the end of this novel, both because of forces interior to and exterior from the text working together, working around each other. What we get from imagining the kind of the thing that Gaskell was going to write and couldn't versus the thing that we have now is almost a liberation, is almost a sense of being able to see the real history anew because of the distance from it that imagining the alternative has granted us. And this is something that comes up quite often in alternate history kind of for itself as well. When we start thinking about how suspense works in kind of canonical alternate history texts, for example, in what's a good example of this? For example, in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, probably the greatest English fantasy novel of the 21st century, in my opinion, amazing piece of work. And the Battle of Waterloo is happening. And you don't know if they're going to win because it's an alternate history. It takes the certainty out of history, right? And as it happens, and I guess this is a mild spoiler, they do win the Battle of Waterloo, and that's kind of a diss on other alternate history from Susanna Clarke, because in alternate history, the English never win the Battle of Waterloo, right? It's one of the big things that changed, like World War II or the American Civil War. So what we're doing is, by putting everything back on the table, we're kind of going back there, and we're suddenly in suspense about how Waterloo is going to turn out, which is not a condition that we can be in the historical novel or in other kinds of realist fiction. And I think there's a virtue to seeing literary composition the same way, right? Think about the inevitability of to be or not to be of the Hamlet soliloquy, and then recall that there are other versions of that text, that we don't know what the real one is. And that any Shakespearean will tell you, being in conversation with those alternate versions heightens your awareness of any given stage production of Hamlet as an editorial decision, as a conscious decision made by people working in conjunction with texts. Okay, so it was by asking, what if this novel, Wives and Daughters, hadn't ended this way, that we got to a place where we can acknowledge the importance of the optative to the interior and exterior of the text as we do have it. And there are two really important things that I want to stress here. The first is that this is still about the text as we do have it. So this isn't fix it. This isn't fan fiction. We are not making up a version of a text, as it were, for its own sake. We're making up a version of the text in order for what it can teach us about the text that we have. And that's why, to me, counterfactual criticism actually goes hand in hand with textual editing. And you'd think that they would be opposites, right? Because textual editing is the minute attention to the words on the page. And counterfactual criticism, I'm talking about it like it exists currently. It exists only in all of our heads, because it's my thing and you're the first people I've ever talked to it about. But counterfactual criticism says the words that aren't on the page are important, right? But actually, any textual editor will tell you they're routinely in conversation with these kinds of alternatives when they come out in front of them. You've got conflicting manuscript versions, or you've got a manuscript where a word is simply illegible. You've got to put something in there. What are you going to choose? These kinds of agonies will be familiar to anyone who's ever tried to edit anything. So I actually think they're really close to each other. And I think what they have in common is that they both really privilege the text that is actually there, just as the purpose of alternate history, if it has one, is to make us think about and engage with the real world and real history as a process, as well as a series of events, much more carefully. I do not buy science fiction fantasy as escape, not for a second. I'm sure none of you do either. The second thing I want to stress at this point is that it's vitally important that this is specific, that this isn't just about contemplating big shifts in plot or character. What if this character was a completely different person, or made a really fundamentally different decision at the end of the first act, or their skin color or gender were different, for example? These are big things, and they're important things. But to me, this is also about what if instead of purple in this sentence, the author had used violet, for example. We can really make this very particular. We can make it very close reading-y. It's about how a small change of emphasis can alter the mood of an entire work. And so it is a kind of formalism for me. Okay, so I'm coming to a kind of conclusion now. Obviously, my examples in this talk are really specific, and they're kind of informed by my background as a Victorianist and somebody who does contemporary science fiction and periodical studies. There's a lot more to say about periodical studies and magazines, but I don't have time, which is probably for the best. My hope is, despite the specificity of what I've been throwing at you, my hope is to extract something that's a little more generally applicable from this kind of nest of interrelated thoughts. And it's all kind of built around this idea that we do this already anyway, so we may as well do it deliberately. Like, it is not my position that I'm inventing something here. I think I'm identifying something that weirdly we don't talk about that much. But it's actually a really effective way of asking yourself a critical question about a text. It's also in the air anyway. If it's something we all do anyway, if it's something that's a growing force in some texts anyway, criticism should always look at what's actually there, even if the best way to do that is by making up something that isn't there anyway. How might this look in a classroom? I just want to mention this for a second. I'm still not sure that I understand what research-led teaching is, but I'm a big believer in teaching-led research. And a lot of this comes from teaching for 3 years a module on alternate history. And I just noticed that I was starting to do this as a way of engaging students. I was saying, okay, instead of saying, how is this author using narrative voice in this text, crickets, I would say, let's imagine this same text, exactly the same, except it's narrated by this character instead of this one. Now, with that in mind, how is that text, how is your imagined text different from this one? And why does that matter? And almost always that generates a richer discussion from students, in my experience. And I got there instinctively, right? It was only after about 6 months that I was like, hey, I'm kind of using alternate history to teach alternate history here. And that's behind the curtain, right? That's where this talk comes from, is teaching led. But I think it's a really good way to teach yourself as well, to ask yourself these questions of something that you're reading. Okay, here's something about this text I think is important. What does it look like if it's not there? Can I run with that for a second? What if I did so rigorously? Okay. Final slide. So this, I don't know if you've seen this. This is, and I will not persuade everyone here of this, and that's fine. You don't have to be persuaded of this. I think this is an extraordinarily clever and witty film that is possibly the best adaptation of Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. It certainly has one of the best Darcys, in my opinion. And I think it's a really, really, it's unlike the book it's based on. And it's interesting, Seth Grahame-Smith has turned up in both keynotes, which I think is kind of fun. I don't have as much admiration for the book as I do for the film, for a lot of reasons. But I think what the film is doing that's really wonderful is it's taking this question of the optative, of the counterfactual, of alternate history, whatever you want to call it, and it's putting genre into it, right? What if Jane Austen, but with zombies? What changes? What stays the same? So those of you who haven't seen this, it's got the first proposal scene, the one Darcy gets wrong, is word for word. The dialogue is exactly the same as in the novel, but they are having an enormous martial arts fight while they're doing it, and it recontextualizes the book in actually a really thoughtful and interesting way. I recommend this movie. I recommend a lot of things. But of course, the reason I'm closing with it is I want to demonstrate to you that alternateness is a thing right now. It's a thing that's beyond science fiction, life after life, our own lives, the optative mood. And elevating it to a critical methodology makes criticism responsive to the world. It makes critics responsible for their imaginations. So I think we're all doing it, and so we should be honest about it. It binds the genres to critical practice, and potentially it engages whole new demographics in the discipline of English literature. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Hey, thank you very much for that, Will. That was a very engaging talk and I really enjoyed it. Have some questions myself, but I'm going to take it to the questions of our audience first. So I have a sort of question, sort of comment from Amy Honsmerk. So she thinks that this is really interesting in terms of thinking about video games, not only in that they often use alternate history for their settings, but also that where often, because you can save and reload, you can explore and act out the what ifs. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's such a good question, Amy, and it comes back to how you replied to my question to you in the earlier session, because often the limit there is the game itself, right? So something that used to really irritate me about Civilization, the game, not actual civilization, although actually this also irritates me about actual Civilization, is that you couldn't decide to have feminism in the Stone Age, right? That game follows an idea of how development works that is actually very closely modeled on Sid Meier's version of how civilization developed. And you can tinker with it. You can do stuff in different orders a little bit. but there are prerequisites. And some of them, I haven't played the latest few Civilization games, so these comments are a little out of date. But there was one in which you couldn't have metallurgy until you'd already had, I think, theocracy? Or so to have metal, you needed first to be a religious dictator. And I was like, well, that seems wrong. So there are, so I think there are, what's interesting always is where the freedom of the player comes up against the limitation of the game. And that's something that you talked about brilliantly when I asked you about it in your session. Of course, the ability to save and reload is important. And I think, Life After Life, Kate Atkinson's novel, which is as far away from a video game as you can imagine any contemporary novel being, has video game logic in it, right? That's what's going on there. I'm absolutely certain that you've seen Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, so I won't waste your time, Amy, by describing that film, that brilliant and very, very clever film. But I think that there's, there's a lot in there. And the other thing I think to say about games in alternate history is that they're early to the party, right? They're doing this before a lot of other bits. Because even in the 1990s, 80s, even we're starting to mess around with this stuff. I don't like long answers to questions, but I will say one more thing. When I was at school, we had a history teacher who was really into reenactment and would tell us the right way to make an arrow and stuff like that. He was a cool history teacher. And one of my classmates got one of the Total War games and was telling him about all the different campaigns you could play and how it's different. And he was like, no, because if they'd had longbow archers on this hill, then this would happen. So he had his expert opinions about how Total War was getting it wrong. But this classmate of mine ended up not getting normal homework because he would be assigned to go and try and get the game to do battles in a certain way. And then he would be graded on how accurately the game kind of played things out based on his opinion of it. So I think, it's absolutely amazing. It's clearly getting better. It's clearly something that is both kind of procedurally interesting if we think about military history, but it's also narratively interesting if we think about something like Assassin's Creed, where we're doing incredibly amazing historical archaeological recovery work on, for example, ancient Rome, and then we're setting genetically enhanced telepsychic super assassins in it. There's a lot to say about that. Okay, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for that question, Amy. It's a lovely question.
Okay, so I think we're going to go with my question, and then we'll see if there's any more questions in the chat. So obviously, what if and world building are massive in science fiction. Are you saying that reading science fiction, how to read science fiction, is a skill that we need to start doing to kind of everyday, or well, I say everyday, kind of canonical texts that are taught on our first year English modules? Is that kind of the idea that you're kind of getting behind when you say that we're bringing in science fiction, particular and popular studies, into kind of literary criticism?
What an interesting question. So you're asking me if I think that everyone should have to read it? Is that what you're saying?
No. So when you read science fiction, a few of the things that are the first that come to mind are the world building and the question about what if. So are you kind of talking about bringing those questions and applying them to things like, I don't know, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, or who else is on, I don't know, Daniel Defoe's Daniel Defoe's works, stuff that's on that everyday kind of curriculum for an English degree?
Yeah, absolutely, I am. Yeah, and I think, I think, part of this is about disciplinary collision, right? Why do we put things next to each other in a scholarly setting? Because we want to learn. That's the basis of the compare and contrast question. So if you read Wives and Daughters immediately after reading 16 alternate history novels, you will read a different novel than if you read it immediately after 5 other Elizabeth Gaskell novels. And this is not a particularly interesting or important insight. What I'm saying is, maybe actually that different reading that you got after doing the alternate history reading, after doing your science fiction reading, maybe that was interesting. Maybe that is something that we're not paying enough attention to at the moment. And so I think always we should be open to letting the new stuff we're reading change the conversation that we're having with things we're more familiar with. I really hope that we can all still do that. Your question kind of Yeah, I think, I mean, I suppose it makes me think of Mark Wolf's argument in his book, Imaginary Worlds, where he says, you know, basically world building has always been a thing, but because of the kind of the hegemony of plot, character, and theme, we just haven't been looking at it. But actually, if you read Jane Austen and think about how it builds its world, you get a really, really different angle on Jane Austen. And this is not to slag off Austen, really important. You realize her genius in a new way, actually, because she gives you this world of, you know, this now from us, even in Britain today, very remote, and even more remote if you're globally situated, this depiction of a society where all the priorities are different and everything is strange and alien and weird to the reader. And she makes it familiar and relatable, and that's world building, right? So I think that there's an enormous amount to be done with that, and I think all you have to do, all you have to do is be open to the idea that we're not just including. This is what I said halfway through. We're not. I hope the battle about reading science fiction at university is won now substantially. The people who really hated it have mostly retired. So at this point, it's now a question of, okay, we have Paradise. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to have another module called science fiction that you choose to take or not to take alongside all the other stuff? Or are we going to say there are opportunities for cross-fertilization here? There are opportunities for the critical method here. What are they?
Particularly with Jane Austen, what reminds me of the world building that most people kind of use is kind of Regency romance. It takes her world building to create its own world building. So that's kind of what came to mind. And if you're just studying plot, character, themes, then you're not seeing how essentially her world building is affecting contemporary culture. But I'm not going to go on about that. That's not my discipline.
No, it's so true though. It's so true. And look, one other thing on this, right? Just because, you know, it's off-brand for me not to have mentioned Star Trek yet. Star Trek is, particularly in the 90s, the Next Generation era, is just completely obsessed with Western high culture, right? It's this genre product, and they are like constantly, if they're not at a tea party, they're visiting Mark Twain, or they're doing Shakespeare on the holodeck, or they're talking about Gilgamesh. You know, they cannot stay away from it. And or Sherlock Holmes as well, very famously with data. And you know, it's that process of rereading high culture, close quotes, through the genre lens. You know, that's, you know, that is where it all comes from. I think science fiction itself as a mode is really interested in this.
I think we have one last question for you. So, is there any relation between counterfactual criticism and critical discourse analysis?
Sorry, while you were saying that, Jade, I was trying to read it in the chat and then it's not there. Can you read it again? I'm really sorry.
No, it's okay. So is there any relation between counterfactual criticism and critical discourse analysis?
Interesting. I mean, there could be. I mean, I suppose my answer to that is like, I'm trying to have my cake and eat it here too, because in one way I'm arguing this is something we've all done all the time, always. And another way I'm saying, like, I just came up with this a couple of months ago and you're the first people I've talked to about it. And the paper is called Towards a Counterfactual Criticism. Can I see a CDA version of it? Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine how you could take these ideas in that direction. I think for me that the furniture of the qualitative is a little bit too reassuring in CDA for me. And so it's not what I do with it, but I think it's awesome as a question, because I think what you're suggesting there is a way of running with this that is really different from what I would have come up with. And I think that you know, that's stage 2. If you want to do that, then let's do that. Show me what it would look like. Why not? And by the way, you know, Gillian Beer says, when scientific theory is advanced, it is at its most fictive, right? We're at the nexus point for counterfactual criticism right now. You know, in years to come, they'll be like, if only someone had asked Tattersdill a question about critical discourse analysis. You know, it's your opportunity. So I would say, you know, go for it. Why not? I'm going to try and publish something about this in the next year or so. And I would appreciate it if you wouldn't publish anything sooner than that. But once it's out, go to town on it. Honestly, I want to see the different places we can take this. Because again, look, as I said at the end of the talk, I'm really blinkered here by a few very, very specific disciplinary places I'm coming from. Not just literary criticism more broadly, but Victorian studies, periodical studies, science fiction studies, and so on. And I think a part of this is that it's going to be really fun to see where other people take it.
We are going to go into another comfort break now, and we will reassemble at 5:30 for our archivist roundtable. Just another kind of social media plug. Feel free to use our hashtag MidSpot2021 if you're interested in saying something about Will's talk, and give us a follow. Other than that, please enjoy your comfort break, and we'll meet back here soon.